The Hardy Boys, Book 1, The Tower Treasure, by Franklin W. Dixon.
Chapter 19, Loot. Lunch, motorcycles, everything else was forgotten. With wild yells of excitement, Frank and Joe hurried down the embankment which flanked the right-of-way. But as they came to a fence that separated the tracks from the grass and weeds that grew along the side, they stopped short. Someone on the highway above was sounding a car horn. Looking up, they recognized the driver. Smuff! "Aw, good night!" Joe cried out. "The last person we want to see right now," Frank said in disgust. "We'll get rid of him in a hurry," Joe determined. The boys turned around and climbed back up the embankment. By this time Oscar Smuff had stepped from his car and was walking down to meet the boys. "Well, I found you," he said. "You mean you've been looking for us?" Frank asked in astonishment. The detective grinned. With an ingratiating air, he explained to the boys that he had trailed them for miles. He had seen them leave home on their motorcycles and almost caught up with them at the Bayport station only to lose them. But the station master had revealed the Hardys' next destination, and the aspiring sleuth had hastened to talk to the flagman, Mike Haley. "He told me I'd find you here," Smuff said, self-satisfaction evident in his tone. "But why do you want us?" Joe demanded. "I've come to make a proposition," Smuff announced. "I've got a swell clue about Jackley and that loot he hid, but I need somebody to help me in the search. How about you fellas? If old Smuff lets you in on his secret, will you help him?" Frank and Joe were astounded at this turn of events. Did the man really know something important, or was he suddenly becoming clever and trying to trick the Hardys into divulging what they knew? One thing the brothers were sure of. They wanted nothing to do with Oscar Smuff until they had searched the old water tower. "Oh, thanks for the compliment," Frank said. He grinned. "Joe and I think we're pretty good ourselves. We're glad you do." "Then you'll work with me?" Smuff asked, his eyes lighting up in anticipation. "I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no," Frank countered. He glanced at Joe, who was standing in back of the detective. Joe shook his head vigorously. "Tell you what, Smuff," Frank went on. "When Joe and I get back to Bayport, we'll look you up. We come out here to have a picnic lunch and relax." Smuff's face fell, but he was not giving up so easily. "When I drove up, I saw you running like mad down the bank. Do you call that relaxing?" "Oh, when you sit around a while eating, your legs feel kind of cramped," Joe told him. "Anyway, we have to keep in practice for the Bayport High baseball team." Smuff looked as if he didn't know whether or not he was being kidded, but finally he said, "Okay, fellas. If you'll get in touch with me the first of the week, I can promise you a big surprise. You've proved you can't win the $1,000 reward alone, so we may as well get a share of it. I've already admitted I need help solve this mystery." He turned and slowly ambled up the embankment to his car. The boys waved good-bye to the detective and waited until he was far out of sight and they were sure he would not return. Then Frank and Joe hurried down the tracks, vaulted the fence, and ran pell-mell toward the old water tower. "If only we have stumbled on the secret," Frank said enthusiastically. "It'll clear Mr. Robinson. We will earn the reward by ourselves. Best of all, Dad will be proud of us." The old water tower reared forlornly alongside the tracks. At close quarters it seemed even more decrepit than from a distance. When the boys glanced at the ladder with its many rungs missing, they wondered if they would be able to ascend to the top of it. "If Jackley climbed this ladder, we can too," said Frank as he stopped, panting at the bottom. "Let's go." He began to scramble up the rotted wood rungs. He had ascended only 4 of them when there came an alarming crack. "Careful!" Joe cried out from below. Frank clung to the rung above just as the one beneath him snapped under his weight. He drew himself up and cautiously put his foot on the next rung. This one was firmer and held his weight. "Hey!" Joe called up. "Don't break all the rungs. I want to come up too." Frank continued to climb the ladder as his brother began the ascent. When they came to any place where a rung had broken off, the boys were obliged to haul themselves up by main force. But finally Frank reached the top and waited until Joe was just beneath him. "There's a trap door up here leading down into the tank," Frank called. "Well, for Pete's sake, be careful," Joe warned. "We don't want any more accidents with trap doors." The boys climbed onto the roof of the tower, which swayed under their weight. Both finally realized their peril. "We can't give up now," said Frank, and scrambled over the surface of the roof until they reached the trap door. Joe followed. They unlatched and raised the door, then peered down into the recesses of the abandoned water tank. It was about 7 feet in depth and 12 in diameter. Frank lowered himself through the opening, but clung to the rim until he was sure, from feeling around with his feet, that the floor would not break through. "It's okay," he told Joe, who followed his brother inside. Eagerly, the boys peered about the dim interior. The place seemed to be partly filled with rubbish. There was a quantity of old lumber, miscellaneous bits of steel rays, battered tin pails, and crowbars, all piled in helter-skelter fashion. At first glance there was no sign of the Applegates' stolen possessions. "The jewels and bonds must be here somewhere," Joe declared. "But if Jackley did put the stuff here, he wouldn't have left it right out in the open. It's probably hidden under some of this junk." Frank pulled out a flashlight and swung it around. In its glow, Joe began to hunt frantically, casting aside the old pails and pieces of lumber. One entire half of the tower was searched without result. Frank turned the flashlight to the far side and noted that a number of boards had been piled up in a rather orderly, crisscrossed manner. "Joe," said Frank, "I'd say these boards hadn't been thrown here accidentally. It sure looks as if somebody had placed them deliberately to hide something underneath." "You're right." Like a terrier after a bone, Joe dived toward the pile. Hastily he pulled away the boards. Revealed in the neat little hiding place lay a bag. It was an ordinary gunny sack, but as Joe dragged it out, he felt sure that the search for the Applegate property had come to an end. "This must be it," he exulted. "The tower treasure." Frank smothered a whoop of joy. Joe carried the sack into the light beneath the trap door. "Hurry up, open it," Frank urged. With trembling fingers, Joe began to untie the cord around the sack. There were many knots, and as Joe worked at them, Frank fidgeted nervously. "Let me try," he said impatiently. At last, with both Hardys working on the stubborn knots, the cord was untied and the bag gaped open. Joe plunged one hand into it and withdrew an old-fashioned bracelet of precious stones. "Jewelry!" "How about the securities?" Again Joe groped into the sack. His fingers encountered a bulky packet. When he pulled it out, the boys exclaimed in unison, "The bonds!" The bundle of papers, held together by an elastic band, proved to be the securities. The first of the documents was a negotiable bond for $1,000 issued by the city of Bayport. "Mr. Applegate's property!" Frank cried out triumphantly. "Joe, do you realize what this means? We've solved the mystery!" The brothers looked at each other almost unbelievingly. Then each slapped the other on the back. "We did it! We did it!" Joe cried out jubilantly. Frank grinned. "And without old Smuff," he said. "Now Mr. Robinson's cleared for sure," Joe exclaimed. "That's the best part of solving this mystery." "You're right." The boys rejoiced over their discovery for another full minute, then decided to hurry back to Bayport with the precious sack. "You go down first, Frank," said Joe. "I'll toss the sack to you and then come myself." He picked up the bag and was about to hoist it to his shoulders when both boys heard a sound on the roof of the tower. They looked up to see an evil-looking, unshaven man peering down at them. "Halt!" he ordered. "Who are you?" Frank asked. "They call me Hobo Johnny," the man replied. "This here's my quarters, and anything in it belongs to me. You got no right in my room. You can't take anything away, and tanks for finding the wad. I never thought to look around." Joe, taken aback a moment, now said, "You may sleep here, but this is railroad property. You don't own what's in this tower. Now go on down the ladder so we can leave." "So you're gonna fight, eh?" Hobo Johnny said in an ugly tone. "I'll see about that." Without warning, the trap door was slammed shut and locked from the outside.